On October 9, 1942, 20,000 feet above the jungle-covered island of Guadalcanal, a 22-year-old American pilot named Marion Parle fought for his life. He flew a Grumman F4F Wildcat, a short, heavy, carrier-based fighter plane, and he was being hunted. His pursuer was a Mitsubishi A6M0, a machine so light and agile it seemed almost futuristic. The Zero could outturn the Wildcat twice over and climb like a rocket. For nearly a year it had haunted the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, dominating every opponent. Marion Parle was an ace pilot, but now he was prey. The Zero was locked onto his tail. He forced his Wildcat into a dive, gaining speed, yet the Japanese fighter stayed close behind him. Parle rolled hard to the right, but the Wildcat's sluggish controls responded slowly. The Zero was already there, predicting his move, its cannons flashing. Parle's cockpit erupted in an explosion of glass and metal. Shrapnel tore through his leg. His controls went dead. Spiraling down, he managed to bail out and land in shark-infested waters, saved only by luck. This was life and death in the Pacific Air War. This was Guadalcanal. Not just a battle, but a grinder that chewed up young men and machines alike. Within weeks, another farm boy from South Dakota would take to that same sky and change everything. The American press called the pilots there the Cactus Air Force. The men themselves called their base, Henderson Field, the graveyard. The problem wasn't only the Japanese Zero, it was American doctrine. The engineers and tacticians back home insisted never turn with a Zero. The same rule applied to P-38 pilots. Rely on speed, armor, and diving attacks, shoot and run. But in the chaotic, swirling dogfights over Guadalcanal, those textbook tactics were getting men killed daily. The Japanese pilots were veterans who had fought over China and Pearl Harbor. They knew their aircraft inside and out. They lured Americans into tight turns, exploiting the Wildcat's sluggish response. They knew exactly where and when to fire. The Americans were losing badly. What the Cactus Air Force couldn't know, and what even the most seasoned Japanese pilots couldn't imagine, was that a solution was coming. It wasn't a new plane or a new manual from Washington. It was a 27-year-old farmer. A man once told he was too old for combat. A man who had learned marksmanship, not from military training, but from hunting jackrabbits on the frozen plains of South Dakota. This is the story of Joseph J. Foss and the simple, forgotten farm trick that made him America's ace of aces. To understand how a farmer could terrify Japan's best aviators, you have to understand where he came from. Joe Foss wasn't a professional soldier. Born in 1915 on an unelectrified farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota, his childhood unfolded in cold winds and hard soil, not classrooms. It was a David and Goliath existence, much like that of Finnish sniper Simo Häyhä. Foss's Goliath wasn't an enemy army, it was survival itself. The Great Depression hit South Dakota like an artillery barrage. The land dried up, the crops failed, and the family had nothing. Foss's sisu, that Finnish word for stubborn grit, came from necessity. He and his father hunted to feed the family, and that's where the modification began, not to a plane, but to the way he saw the world. When 12-year-old Joe hunted jackrabbits, he didn't have a scope, just an old shotgun and one rule from his father: don't waste shells. Rabbits never ran straight. They zigzagged, darted, reversed direction. To hit one, you couldn't aim at it. You had to aim ahead of it, where it would be. That's called deflection shooting. While other kids studied arithmetic, Joe was calculating lead, wind, and motion in his head in fractions of a second. He wasn't just a marksman, he was a natural hunter, mastering the physics of hitting moving targets. That was his real gun sight, the farmer's instinct no manual could teach. Yet Joe didn't want to spend his life hunting, he wanted to fly. In 1933, his father took him to an air show where a Marine squadron performed in biplanes. At 18, he was hooked. "That's what I'm going to do," he told his father. The path seemed impossible. He was poor, undereducated, and after his father was tragically killed by a downed power line, Joe, then 19, had to quit school and run the farm, but he never gave up. Working the fields by day and attending night classes, he took 6 years to earn enough credits for college. He washed dishes to pay for flight lessons and finally earned his pilot's license. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Joe Foss was 26 years old. He raced to enlist in the Navy as a combat pilot and was rejected. He was too old. In 1941, the cutoff age for fighter pilots was 25. The Navy offered him an instructor post instead, training younger men for combat. It was a crushing disappointment. The rule books said he was unfit for war. So, like every rule breaker in history, he found a loophole. Foss joined the Marine Corps Reserve and became a flight instructor. For 9 long months, he watched his 20-year-old students go off to fight while he stayed behind, grounded. Furious, he badgered his superiors, wrote letters, and made himself impossible to ignore. "I was the loudest, most annoying instructor in the Navy," he later said. Eventually, just to quiet him down, they relented. He was sent to advanced fighter training and assigned to VMF 121. And in October 1942, as Marion Carl fell flaming from the sky, 27-year-old Joe Foss, the too old farmer from South Dakota, boarded a transport ship bound for Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. What awaited him wasn't a base, it was hell. The moment Joe Foss stepped off the plane at Guadalcanal, the stench hit him. A thick, humid mix of engine oil, rotting jungle, and death. The runway stretched before him, a rough strip of dirt and gravel carved from the palms, pockmarked and scarred by constant shelling. The operations center was nothing more than a wooden shack called the Pagoda. The pilot's quarters were tents with mud floors, and everywhere he looked were the wrecks. Dozens of F4F Wildcats and P-39s shoved off to the sides, wings torn away, engines shattered, cockpits stained with oil and blood. This was the graveyard of the Cactus Air Force. Foss found his assigned tent and met the men he would fly with. They weren't the fresh-faced trainees he'd once instructed. These were hollow-eyed veterans, their faces yellowed by atabrine, the bitter anti-malaria drug, their eyes bloodshot from exhaustion, their flight suits soaked with sweat and grime. They were survivors, but also hunted men. When Foss, the old man and farmer, walked in, they barely looked up. To them, he was just another replacement for the pilot who had died yesterday. His assigned plane, a Grumman F4F Wildcat, was the same model Marion Carl had been shot down in. It was tough but sluggish, a heavy, underpowered machine often described as a flying coffin when facing the nimble Japanese Zero. The squadron's executive officer, a man named Duke, gave him the standard briefing, the same one that had sent so many pilots to their deaths. Never turn with a Zero. Never. Foss listened and nodded, but inside he understood something the doctrine didn't. He understood jackrabbits. The next morning, Foss flew his first mission, straight into the kill zone, a farmer in a flying coffin facing the most advanced fighter on Earth, and he was about to use a trick no manual had ever mentioned. His first flight over Guadalcanal was no training run, it was baptism by fire. Climbing to 15,000 feet, he scanned the vast Pacific sky. The veterans had warned him, the enemy comes out of the sun. You don't see them until they're already shooting. Leading his first patrol, Foss felt blind. Then suddenly the radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. He looked up and saw them, a formation of Mitsubishi Zeros diving fast, faster than anything he'd ever encountered. He remembered his orders, don't turn, dive and run. Shoving the stick forward, he plunged his Wildcat into a screaming dive. The heavy plane gained speed as tracers zipped past his canopy, close enough to make him flinch. He dove all the way to the treetops and finally shook the Zeros off his tail. When he landed at Henderson Field, his hands were trembling, not from fear, but fury. The doctrine was wrong, you couldn't win by running. That only postponed death. And Joe Foss hadn't come to Guadalcanal to survive. He had come to hunt. On October 13th, just days after his arrival, Foss led another patrol. They intercepted a group of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros, and chaos erupted. The sky became a spinning tangle of contrails and smoke. Foss spotted a Zero closing in on his wingman's tail. Doctrine said to dive away, to find an easier target. But the farmer's instinct said otherwise. He rolled his Wildcat sharply, not aiming at the Zero, but at the spot where it would be. He squeezed the trigger. His 6.5 caliber machine guns thundered. For 3 long seconds, he fired not at the plane, but at a patch of empty sky 200 feet ahead of it. To anyone watching, it looked like a miss, but the Japanese pilot, fixated on his own kill, never saw Foss. He pulled his tight turn, straight into the stream of bullets. The Zero's wing tore off in a flash of flame and metal. Foss had his first kill. He hadn't outturned the Zero. He hadn't outrun it. He had outthought it, using the same deflection logic that had once brought down jackrabbits on the plains. That farmer's instinct had triumphed where the manuals failed. When he landed, the men gathered around. Foss was no longer the new guy. He told his crew chief, "This plane's a truck, but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." To his fellow pilots he said, "Forget what they told you. Don't chase them. Lead them. Lead until you think you'll miss, then lead some more. They'll fly right into it." This was his piano wire modification, a mental upgrade, not a mechanical one. It was the farmer's confidence reborn in the cockpit. The squadron listened, desperate for anything that worked. Their ace, Marion Carl, was still recovering. They needed a leader, and the 27-year-old farmer was the only man talking about hunting, not surviving. Foss took command of his ragtag group of 8 Wildcats, the castoffs and replacements. They had no reputation, no nickname, until the war correspondents watching them gave them one: Foss's Flying Curses. On October 16th, the Curses went to work. Foss led his 8 planes straight into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. 32 to 8! It was madness, a suicide mission. But Foss had a plan. He wasn't going to dogfight, he was going to hunt. He ordered his men to use the Thotch weave, a new defensive tactic, where pilots flew in pairs, covering each other's tails. Foss dove in, spotted a Zero, pulled lead, and fired. The enemy exploded. Another Zero dove at him, but his wingman, weaving beside him, rolled over and blasted it off Foss's tail. In 10 minutes of furious, twisting combat, Foss's flight of 8 downed 5 Japanese planes. Foss got 2 himself. When they returned to Henderson Field, all 8 planes intact, the graveyard suddenly had hope. The victories mounted quickly. October 18th, Foss shot down 2 more. October 20th, another one. By October 23rd, just 10 days after his first kill, Joe Foss was officially an ace with 5 victories. On October 25th, he destroyed 3 Zeros in a single day. The old man, the farmer from South Dakota, had become the deadliest pilot on Guadalcanal. He wasn't just fighting, he was leading, teaching others to think like hunters. His flying curses ruled the skies. But like every legend from Simo Heiha to Marion Carl, Foss's meteoric success came at a terrible cost. The Japanese were enraged. Their pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The seemingly invincible Zero fighters were being destroyed by heavy American Wildcats, aircraft they had once dismissed as obsolete. It made no sense. Yet one name kept appearing in their intercepted radio transmissions: Foss. Japanese High Command began to take notice. Just as the Soviet Stavka had studied Simo Heiha, and as ace Saburo Sakai had studied the P-38s, the Japanese realized they were no longer just fighting American planes. They were fighting Foss's flying circus. The battle for Guadalcanal had become personal. On November 7th, Foss led his flight into the air when a squadron of elite Japanese aces ambushed them. The sky exploded into chaos. Foss shot down 2 Zeros before cannon shells slammed into his Wildcat from behind. His engine burst into flames, smoke filling the cockpit. He bailed out, his aircraft plunging into the jungle below. Miraculously, he was rescued, bruised but alive. Just 2 days later, he was back in the air, chasing a Japanese float plane. Focused entirely on his prey, Foss failed to notice the rear gunner. A burst of fire shattered his engine, and for the second time in 3 days, his plane was doomed. But this time, he wasn't above land. He was over the open ocean. He ditched his Wildcat into the Pacific. It struck the water hard and sank within half a minute. Alone, 10 miles from shore, he found himself adrift in the Slot, one of the most shark-infested waters on Earth. He floated in his life vest as the daylight faded and the water chilled. He had only his will to survive. Then he saw the Finns, dozens of them, circling. They bumped against him, testing. The hunter of Zeros had become the hunted. Foss treaded water for hours, surrounded by silent predators. He had no weapon, no radio, nothing but the hard patience of a farmer who knew how to wait. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, a canoe appeared in the distance. It was manned by native islanders, sent by an Australian coast watcher who had seen the crash by sheer luck. They paddled toward him, striking the water with their oars to drive off the sharks. They pulled the exhausted, half-conscious pilot from the sea and brought him back to Henderson Field. Foss was a wreck. Exposure, malaria, and exhaustion had ravaged him. Doctors grounded him immediately, confining the ace of aces to a hospital bed. His squadron had to fight on without him. The Japanese, hearing rumors of his death, celebrated. The ghost of Guadalcanal, they thought, was gone. They were wrong. For 2 fever-filled weeks, Joe Foss lay in that hospital, trembling and hallucinating, but thinking only of one thing. The jackrabbits were getting away. As soon as he could stand, he signed himself out, climbed into a new Wildcat, and, on November 30th, returned to the hunt. That day, he shot down another Zero. The ghost was back, and this time he was furious. The Japanese threw everything they had at him, but Foss kept coming. By January 15, 1943, his victory count stood at 23. He was just 3 kills short of the all-time American record, 26, set during World War I by the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker. For 2 decades, no one had even come close. Now a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota, flying what many called a flying coffin, was about to rewrite history. By January 1943, the name Joe Foss was legend at Guadalcanal, a legend etched in fever, exhaustion, and gunfire. The malaria had returned with a vengeance. He flew with a burning fever, shaking uncontrollably after every mission. Ground crews often had to lift his drenched, trembling body out of the cockpit after landing his bullet-riddled Wildcat. He was fighting 2 wars at once, one against the Japanese in the sky and another against the parasite raging in his blood. And somehow, he was winning both. That sacred number 26 had become a mountain, a symbol of ultimate American air power. No one believed it could be matched. Yet Foss, half delirious with fever, was determined to climb it. On January 15, 1943, he woke sicker than ever. The doctors forbade him to fly. He ignored them. Dragging himself into his Wildcat, head pounding and hand shaking, he took off. A massive Japanese convoy, the Tokyo Express, was approaching the island, shielded by a swarm of fighters. Foss and his flying Circus were ordered to intercept. The sky filled with aircraft, the largest battle he had ever seen. Zeros and Wildcats tangled in violent spirals of smoke and flame. Foss's vision blurred, but his instincts took over. He saw a Zero closing on a wingman and reacted instantly. He aimed not at the plane, but at the empty air where it would be, just like the jackrabbits. He fired. The Zero flew straight into his bullets and exploded. Kill number 24. Scanning the chaos, he spotted another Zero diving on a group of wildcats. Foss rammed the throttle forward, cutting across the attacker's path. The Japanese pilot tried to outturn him, the classic Japanese tactic. Foss didn't fall for it. He performed a high side pass, rolling over the top of the Zero and dropping into its blind spot. A single burst. The enemy disintegrated. Kill number 25. He had tied Rickenbacker's record. Foss was now officially a living legend. But he wasn't done. He saw one more enemy, a Japanese roof floatplane fighter breaking away from the battle. Foss dove after it. The roof pilot climbed desperately, trying to escape. It was the ultimate test, the seasoned Japanese ace versus the farmer's instinct. Foss didn't follow, he calculated. He read the plane's line of escape and fired an impossibly long, arcing deflection shot, a shot that seemed to defy physics itself. The .5 caliber rounds traced a perfect arc through the air, meeting the fleeing Japanese fighter at the exact point where its pilot thought he'd escaped. The bullet struck directly into the cockpit. The roof spiraled downward, tumbling end over end before crashing into the Pacific. That was kill number 26. In a single afternoon, while feverish and half delirious from malaria, Joe Foss had shot down 3 enemy aircraft. He had tied and then broken America's long-standing record for aerial victories. When he landed at Henderson Field, the entire base was waiting for him. The graveyard had become a field of triumph. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force lifted their two-old farmer out of the cockpit and carried him on their shoulders. He was now, beyond any doubt, America's ace of aces. While the men at Guadalcanal celebrated, the Japanese High Command at Rabaul mourned. For months, their pilots had flown with supreme confidence in their superb A-6M Zero fighters. They had been veterans, disciplined, experienced, flying aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver the slower American Wildcats. Their doctrine had always worked: force the Wildcat into a turn, slip behind its tail, and finish the kill. Then Foss's flying Circus appeared, and everything changed. Seasoned Japanese aces returned to their carriers, shaken and pale, telling their intelligence officers stories that made no sense. They said they would dive on a Wildcat expecting it to flee, but it didn't. They said they would lure it into a turning fight, but it refused to follow. Instead, the American plane would roll or dive or climb in ways that seemed random, firing bursts into empty sky, and a heartbeat later, a nearby Zero would explode. They couldn't explain it. They were being hunted by a kind of logic they didn't understand, a farmer's logic. Joe Foss had done what Simo Häyhä once did on the frozen battlefields of Finland. He stripped the enemy of every advantage. Häyhä had hidden his rifle's glint and breath to become invisible. Foss hid his intentions by never aiming directly at his prey. The Japanese pilots were fighting an unseen opponent, a phantom modification forged not from metal, but from instinct, from the mind of a South Dakota hunter. He had shattered their confidence. He had proven the Zero was not invincible, and that an inferior aircraft in the hands of a pilot who understood motion, timing, and patience could be the deadliest weapon in the sky. The hunters had become the hunted. But victory came at a terrible cost. Foss's price wasn't a single bullet, it was exhaustion and disease. Days after breaking the record, malaria overwhelmed him. His body wasted away. He lost over 30 pounds. The man who had faced down zeros and sharks was being consumed from within. He left Guadalcanal not to cheers, but on a stretcher, a gaunt, yellow-skinned shadow of the warrior he had been. He was flown first to Pacific hospitals, then home to the United States, a national hero and a broken man. But Joe Foss still had that susu, that unbreakable farmer's grit. Months of recovery followed in a naval hospital in San Diego, and on May 18, 1943, in the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation praised his dauntless courage and incomparable skill in combat. But his true legacy wasn't just in medals, it was in what he proved. In 1942, America was losing the Pacific War. The Zero was considered unbeatable, the Japanese unstoppable. In 44 days, Joe Foss destroyed that myth. With 26 kills, he showed that an American farm boy in an American plane could defeat the best pilots Japan could send. His techniques, deflection shooting and the thatch weave, became doctrine across the Pacific. He had not only saved Guadalcanal, he had rewritten the playbook for air combat and helped turn the tide of the war. When the guns finally fell silent, Foss didn't cling to fame or rank. Like Simo, he went home to his fields. He used his name not for glory, but for service. He entered politics, won a seat in the South Dakota legislature, and in 1954, that same too-old farm boy became governor of South Dakota. Later, he served as the first commissioner of the American Football League, a national figure, but always at heart a man of the land. Because that was who Joe Foss truly was, a farmer who understood the brutal simplicity of the hunt. Wars are not won by theory or machinery, but by individuals who see flaws and dare to fix them. James McKenna saw a flaw in the P-38's control cables and fixed it with 6 inches of piano wire. Simo saw the flaw in sniper optics and returned to iron sights. Joe Foss saw the flaw in his Wildcat, that it could never outturn a Zero, and fixed it not with tools, but with his own trained eye. These are the forgotten pages of history, the stories of men who broke the rules and in doing so saved lives. Joe Foss died in 2003 at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, a hero to his country, a legend to the Marine Corps, and a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the American farmer. If you found his story as powerful as we did, help keep it alive. Like this story, share it, and subscribe to hear more untold chapters of World War II. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And wherever you're watching from Texas to Tasmania, thank you for helping preserve the memory of those who refused to give up.